Welcome to a special bonus episode of Saturday Cappuccino with the Saints as we continue our series on the unseen realm this week. We've been talking about the Nephilim for a few weeks now, giants, so to speak, and it gets even weirder and more interesting this week. And there are many giant clans, as we discussed last time. Many. In fact, the destruction and removal of these clans from the Promised Land is largely what the book of Joshua and the other tales of the conquest are all about. These are the tribes of the Nephilim, the Rephaim, the Anakim, the Emim, and, the coolest sounding of them all, the Zamzummim. I will say, every time I read that name, I swear it sounds like some sort of new age band that I watched on MTV back in the early 80s. I can just see them now, heavy on the synthesizers and with skinny little ties and spiked up hair. Coming up next with their new hit song rocking the charts, the Zamzummim. If you're of a certain age like me, I know exactly the image that has formed in your head right now. But the most mysterious of all these guys are the shadowy tribe of the Rephaim. Now, just exactly who were they? The Rephaim are always clouded in a sinister, mysterious shroud every time they are mentioned. There are a few clues about them that can be derived just from their name. The term Rephaim carries two distinct meanings in the Hebrew Bible. One is that it means giants or mighty people, like the other giant clans we've been talking about. In historical and narrative texts, the Rephaim are portrayed as a race of unusually tall and powerful individuals who lived in Canaan and the surrounding regions before the Israelites arrived. And the other meaning of Rephaim means departed spirits. In poetic and prophetic literature, such as Isaiah 14:9 or Proverbs 9:18, the term refers to them as the dead in Sheol, suggesting a connection to the realm of the deceased. So, what is worse than a giant? Well, how about the evil dead spirit of a giant? That seems much worse. The root of the word Rephaim, Rapha, can imply weak or dead, depending on the context. It's ironic and in stark contrast to the normal association we have with giants. In ancient Ugaritic texts, there is a mention of the Rephaim, R-P-U-M, which are possibly semi-divine ancestral spirits, suggesting a broader ancient Near Eastern belief in heroic or giant ancestors. The Rephaim specifically are mentioned in several places in the Bible. In Genesis 14:5, the Rephaim are defeated by King Chedorlaomer, indicating their early presence in the land of Canaan. In Deuteronomy 2, verses 20 to 21, they are described as strong and tall, like the Anakim, another giant clan. Passages in Joshua 12:4 and 1 Chronicles 20, verses 4 through 8, reinforce their reputation as formidable warriors and link them to other giant clans like the Emim and, my favorite, the Zamzummim. And then we have this. Now, I just have to comment on this. I will say up front, however, that I think that this theory is complete nonsense, but it was too crazy not to share. In my wild and strange journey through the wackier side of the internet researching this topic, you can only imagine some of the insane things that have come up. Trust me, if I commented on all of them, this episode would run 30 hours long. I will spare all of you that. But I had to show this one. Here is a chart someone meticulously created linking the tribes of the Nephilim to individual species of Sasquatch, otherwise known as Bigfoot. Honestly, I didn't know that there were different types of Bigfoot around, or would it be big feet? What is the plural of Bigfoot? Anyhow, see, you learn something new every day. Well, I have to admit, that was an angle I was not expecting. You have to trudge through some really crazy sites to research this topic. I mean, it's crazy, and it has been a challenge. Suffice to say, I am not on board with the Nephilim Bigfoot connection, but if only for its amusement value, I thought it worthy of sharing. This was your bonus material contained in your bonus episode this week. I aim to entertain as well as inform. And who knew that when I was a little kid and transfixed by watching the greatest single episode of the $6 Million Man show ever to air, the one where he battles Bigfoot, I was actually watching A Tale of the Nephilim. My late mother would have probably been far more tolerant of my watching that show if I had explained to her that it was all very biblical. That show, like many other things from the 70s, hasn't aged that well. But I will say that 10-year-old Paul thought that this was the most fantastic thing ever to air on television. Times, of course, do change. But it gets serious again. We back to the Bible. In Deuteronomy 3:11, we learn the name of one of these Rephaim, Og, king of Bashan. He is referred to as the last of the Rephaim and is most famous for his iron bed that was about 13 feet long, underscoring his immense size. There'll be a lot more about Og's bed in just a moment. But a big hint to the nature of King Og is the fact that he is the king of Bashan. The word Bashan is derived from the Proto-Ugaritic language, and it means serpent. That should immediately put a connotation in your mind of that serpent back in the garden. You know, I was really having a bad case of MWS, map withdrawal syndrome. We have gone quite a while without me referencing one, and I was starting to get the shakes. So this will definitely sate that urge. What you see here is a map of where the ancient kingdom of Bashan has been overlaid over a modern map of the area. You can see that ancient Bashan is right on the border of Syria and Israel, and includes the Golan Heights. Mount Hermon, which we have discussed several times in this series, is also included on the northern edge of Bashan. So, it appears that the sinister reputation Bashan had in ancient biblical times has a root. Mount Hermon, as you know, was the home base of Baal or Baal, and with Bashan also including the modern areas of the Golan Heights and the country of Syria as well, it seems that the evil reputation of the area of the world where Bashan existed continues into the 21st century. So with Og being the last of the Rephaim and the king of Bashan, a name whose root means serpent, and as part of his kingdom he has the mountain, Mount Hermon, where Baal dwells, well, you can see that Og can safely be categorized as a bad guy. Another interesting tie-in with this Bashan is this. One of the most famous of Jesus' last words on the cross is his saying, my God, why have you forsaken me?" We all know that saying from Christ on the cross. But what many don't know is that this is just the first verse of the complete passage that Jesus was probably quoting at the time. This is the opening line of Psalm 22. Now, these numbers for Psalms did not exist in Jesus' day. That is a relatively modern convention. The Psalms were numbered from their earliest use as individual hymns, but the standardized numbering systems we know today developed over centuries. In the time of Jesus, each psalm was referred to by its opening line. For example, where we will refer to Psalm 23, they would call it, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." So when Jesus cries out on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Most scholars agree that what is being referenced in the gospel is Jesus praying the entirety of Psalm 22, which begins with that phrase. He would have prayed the entire psalm. And if we read Psalm 22, down on verses 12 to 14, it says the following. Many bulls surround me. Strong bulls of Bashan encircle me. Roaring lions that tear their prey open their mouths wide against me. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart has turned to wax. It has melted within me. Jesus was praying these words as he was dying. So, one thing leaps out here. What is meant by the phrase, the Bulls of Bashan? The late Dr. Michael Heiser, along with most other biblical scholars, are in pretty much full agreement on this. The Bulls of Bashan is a reference to the pagan god Baal. Mount Hermon, which is in Bashan, was where Baal had his home. Bashan was Baal's home turf. The idol used in Baal worship was a golden calf or bull, and that should ring a bell. The golden calf, of course, was also the idol that the Israelites worshipped in the wilderness when Moses was delayed on Mount Sinai. This was yet another time, one of many, that Baal seduced the ancient Israelites to worship him instead of the true God. Baal is throughout the Old Testament portrayed as the chief rival spiritual being to God. So when Jesus prayed this psalm, he was acknowledging the fact that at his crucifixion, he was surrounded by these unclean fallen spiritual beings, led by their chief Baal, there to witness their quote-unquote so-called triumph. These bulls of Bashan had gathered together at this most crucial moment in history to gloat over the death of the true and only begotten Son of the Most High. No doubt, they thought that this was the moment of their ultimate victory for their dark power. And remember, too, Baal really is just another name for the devil. His name means the Lord or Master, and also son of El, God. Ironic given the context, right? He has traditionally been associated as the chief of all the gods of the nations who oppose God. He is paralleled in other mythological portrayals as well. Zeus, Thor, Ra, Marduk, they're all referencing the same being, this bull of Bashan. And to put a little icing on this bull of Bashan cupcake, if you remember back in August when we discussed the Transfiguration, well, where did that take place? On top of Mount Hermon, the home of Baal and the rest of the Canaanite pantheon. Jesus revealing himself as his true identity there was the ultimate taunt to the dark powers. And at the base of Mount Hermon was the Grotto of Pan, otherwise known as the Rock. This was the site of another famous incident in Jesus' life, where he said to Peter, "Upon this rock I will build my church." The rock he was referring to is this one you see here, a site of unbelievable atrocities, perverted sex rituals, and blood sacrifices, including human sacrifices, to the demonic spirits for thousands of years. And interestingly enough, the site, according to the pagans, was also known as the entrance to the underworld, or, as we would call it today, hell. So Jesus revealed himself as truly God at the top of Mount Hermon, obviously enraging the bulls of Bashan, and at the base of that mountain, he said he would build his church on top of the ruins of hell itself. And this is where God, in his infinite wisdom, played the best switcheroo trick of all times. The satanic powers that were surrounding Jesus at the time of his crucifixion, and thinking that they had won the ultimate battle of all battles, should have paid a little more attention to the rest of what Jesus said at the base of the mountain. This was not the moment of their ultimate triumph. It was the signifier of their ultimate, total, and irrevocable defeat. Because 3 days after his death on the cross, Jesus rose from the dead and destroyed the power of death and the rule of hell forever. So, joke's on Baal, right? He goes from what he thinks is his ultimate triumph to his complete and total destruction in one move. Check and mate. But back to the Rephaim and King Og. Bashan, apart from its sinister reputation, was a fertile region east of the Jordan River, encompassing 60 fortified cities and villages. They were a formidable foe to the Israelites during the initial phases of the conquest. King Og confronted the Israelites at Edrei during their journey to the Promised Land. Despite his fearsome reputation, Moses led Israel to victory, annihilating King Og's forces and claiming his land. There are many interesting traditions, both in the Midrash, which is an ancient Jewish commentary on the scriptures, and even in Islam, that expand the stories and legends about King Og. King Og, as last of the Rephaim, has captured the imagination of believers for centuries. Here you see an example, a 15th century Islamic art work from Persia that depicts King Og towering over groups of people. The Midrash further suggests that he lived for centuries and may have survived the flood by clinging to Noah's Ark. You have to admit, this is a creative interpretation of Scripture, I must say, but this is more evidence that King Og has always been linked back to the Nephilim, which was the reason for the flood in the first place. And these commentators in the Midrash also went so far as to speculate about the parents of Og. Some claimed he descended from Samshazai and Azazel, angels who fell to earth and became corrupt and were associated with the Genesis 6 narrative, further linking Og to the Nephilim narrative. And of course, you remember Azazel. Not only does the book of Enoch refer to him as one of the watchers that were part of the Genesis 6 incident, but also one of the fallen angels who taught mankind forbidden arts. We discussed this parallel with the Apkallu a few weeks ago. Azazel also shows up often in the Bible. In Leviticus 16, Azazel is mentioned during the Day of Atonement ceremony on Yom Kippur. 2 goats were chosen, one for the Lord that was sacrificed, and one for Azazel that was sent into the wilderness. The high priest would symbolically place the sins of the people on the goat for Azazel, which was driven into the desert. This is the origin, by the way, of the term scapegoat. And it is interesting to note that the early Israelites thought that Azazel was Og's dad. It's all related and very fascinating. Continuing on, now, I know Christmas is coming up in just a few weeks, and many of you are wondering what to get the women in your life this year for a present. And many might want to get something inspirational. Lots of people get Bible verse related gifts. Go into any Christian themed gift shop in the country, and there's an infinite array of options. Inspirational gifts are always a good choice. You will see John 3:16 emblazoned on coffee mugs, verses from Psalm 23 rendered in needlepoint on throw pillows or blankets. Bible verses and related gifts are always very popular. Now here's a bet I'm willing to make. There is no one anywhere on earth who has Deuteronomy 3:11 stitched on a pillow. For only Og, king of Bashan, remained of the remnant of the giants. Behold, his bedstead was a bedstead of iron. Is it not in Rabbath of the children of Ammon? 9 cubits was the length thereof, and 4 cubits the breadth of it, after the cubit of a man. Deuteronomy 3:11. So, what on earth is this all about? It is about the most famous bed in the Bible, King Og's bed. 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide translates to roughly 13.5 feet by 6 feet, assuming a standard cubit of about 18 inches. The bed was reportedly kept in Rabbath of the Ammonites, roughly modern-day Amman, Jordan, possibly as a relic or a trophy. Some scholars debate whether the term bed refers to a funerary bier or sarcophagus, or throne rather than a literal sleeping bed. But others suggest that the listing of King Og's bed and the seemingly trivial details, or trivial to us, about the size of it and make of the bed would immediately call to mind something to the ancient readers that is completely lost on us. In ancient Mesopotamia, sacred beds were used in rituals known as hieros gamos, the sacred marriage, where the kings ritually united with temple priestesses in ceremonies that symbolized the union of a god and goddess. I briefly spoke about this back when we discussed the Tower of Babel story. In Amorite theology, this often involved Marduk, the high god associated with order and kingship. The king, acting as the god's representative and possessed by his spirit, would participate in these rites to affirm his rule and draw divine power into the land. These were not benign fertility rituals. They were reenactments of the transgression described in Genesis 6. By imitating the Genesis 6 pattern through ritualized sex, they sought to produce new Nephilim, offspring that were half God and half man. Sound familiar? And if you remember from our earlier episode about the Divine Council, these sorts of rituals still take place, such as the night with the goddess ceremony the emperors of Japan still undergo upon accession to the throne, or the ritual prostitutes that still serve in many temples in India. It's all very Genesis 6-y, isn't it? And, as it turns out, a few of these ancient ritual beds have been discovered by archaeologists in Iraq and throughout the Middle East in digs at ancient temple sites. And you know how big they were? They were all the same size as reported for King Og's bed. This is not accidental. The dimensions that were given in the Bible for the size of King Og's bed telegraph what it was used for, these creepy demonic sex rituals with fallen angels. It puts a whole new spin on this verse, doesn't it? And I have to add this. Anyone who claims that the Bible is boring isn't really reading it right. This is some fascinating stuff here. And it gets, believe it or not, even weirder. And the weirdness stretches into our own day and time. The man you see on your screen here is someone you may not be familiar with, but you have been affected by his work. This is Jack Parsons, the founder of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory and an early pioneer of rocketry. He developed the jet-assisted takeoff, JATO technology for the U.S. military, and also invented the first composite solid rocket fuel, revolutionizing propulsion systems for jets. He had an enormous impact on our country, and despite lacking any formal degrees, he laid the foundation for space exploration. But here is why I'm mentioning Jack Parsons this morning, and it has nothing to do with rockets. I'm referring to his other work, his work in the occult, and especially his connection with the OTO, the Ordo Templi Orientis, and the Order of Thelema, both of which were led and founded by Aleister Crowley, who you see here, who was referred to as the wickedest man in the world. Crowley also referred to himself as the Beast, so that should give you a big hint about him. Crowley, as many of you no doubt know, was essentially the founder of the first truly satanic religious order of the modern era, the Church of Thelema. So, you can clearly see where this story is heading. And Jack Parsons was also a partner in these occultic rituals designed by Aleister Crowley with his good pal, L. Ron Hubbard. You remember him? He was the founder of Scientology. So, the plot is definitely thickening. And here's the connection between Jack Parsons, Og, and these ritual beds. It has to do with a series of occult rituals that Parsons and his girlfriend Marjorie Cameron engaged in back in 1946. Parsons called these rituals Babylon working, which should give you a clue as to what was being attempted. The Babylon working rituals were a series of occult ceremonies performed by Jack Parsons aimed at invoking the Thelemic goddess Babylon into human form through sex magic and satanic invocations. Parsons sought to manifest Babylon, the divine feminine force in Thelema, as a living woman who would usher in a new spiritual age. Interestingly enough, and I just placed this historical tidbit out there as information, so make of it what you will, but it was shortly after he started these rituals that Marjorie just sort of showed up on his doorstep. Creepy, to say the least. Influenced by Aleister Crowley's teachings, Parsons believed the rituals were designed to create a magical child, a spiritual entity that could be directed into a human womb. This sounds exactly like what was happening in these pagan temples back in Og's day. And I will be honest, it puts a renewed sinister spin on the fact that these so-called Nephilim romance books are so popular right now. A very sinister spin. And here's another mind-blowing fact about these Nephilim. According to the way a first-century Jew of Jesus' day would think, they are all still around. You see, it referenced all over the time in the New and Old Testament, but I think the illusion just goes right over our heads. I'm talking about the term unclean spirits. You see that term referenced in the Bible often, but do you know what it is referring to? Are these ghosts that just need to hit the showers? No, it has nothing to do with that kind of clean. The term unclean references the ritual purity laws that dominate the books of the Old Testament. And, to be honest, most Christians, including myself, tend to skim right over these passages as they really don't make a lot of sense to us. We don't practice kosher law, so our minds start to wander when these long sections of the Bible refer to purity laws. And I think because of that, we miss the reference. Analyzing all of the food laws and other purity laws of Israel, you will see there is definitely a pattern. Jewish purity laws are not about hygiene or morality, but about ritual fitness, the ability to enter sacred space or perform holy acts. Impurity arises when boundaries are breached, especially those separating life and death, such as the many places where they forbid contact with corpses, or human and animal, such as forbidding touching an unclean animal, sacred and profane, such as improper temple access, male and female fluids, such as the many passages about menstrual blood or semen. Even how certain animals were declared unclean followed this logic. Unclean animals blur categories, such as pigs that have split hooves and don't chew cud. This violates the ideal of wholeness. To be a clean seafood, an animal must have both fins and scales. Otherwise, they are seen as an impure mixture. It can all seem very arbitrary and weird to us, but these breaches are seen as disruptions of the divine order, and purification rituals aim to restore the balance. In Leviticus 18-20, it prohibits sexual unions that confuse species, kinship, or gender roles, seen as defiling the land. In Leviticus 11, it bans consumption of animals that don't fit clean categories, such as pigs or shellfish, that are unclean because they blur boundaries. In Deuteronomy 22, verses 9 through 11, it forbids sowing of mixed seeds, yoking different animals together, or wearing mixed fabrics, all symbolic of preserving divine distinctions. These laws reflect a worldview where mixture equals chaos, and purity equals order, separation, and wholeness. And the Nephilim are the ultimate example of this unholy mixing and chaos. Born of angelic and human union, they violate the boundary between heaven and earth, and are the quintessential example of something unclean. And after death, their spirits become unclean spirits, neither human or angel. They are restless, bodiless, and perpetually impure. That comes from 1 Enoch, chapter 15. And that is why the term Rephaim is so unique. They are portrayed in the Bible and ancient Near Eastern texts as both a race of ancient giants and the disembodied spirits of these dead giants. Over time, they came to symbolize the shadowy, restless dead who dwell in the underworld, blending mythic memory with theological warning. You see references to this throughout the Bible. In Psalm 88, verse 10, they say, "Do the Rephaim rise to praise you?" In Isaiah 26, verse 14, they say, "The dead will not live, the Rephaim will not rise." And the story is fleshed out even more detail in the book of Enoch. In the book of Enoch, Enoch 1, verses 15 to 16, teaches that when the Nephilim died in the flood, their disembodied spirits became unclean spirits. These spirits were condemned to wander the earth, tormenting humanity forever. And that leads us to another area entirely. And is a good point for a quiz. So, the question is this: who performed the first exorcism recorded in the Bible? Time's up. The answer is Jesus. That's right. Jesus was the first explicit exorcist that cast out unclean spirits in the Bible. And it is interesting to note, in the Gospel of Mark, specifically Mark chapter 1, verses 23 to 26, the first public act of his ministry was the casting out of an unclean spirit in the synagogue. I will read the passage. "In that synagogue there was a man with an unclean spirit. And he shrieked, 'What do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God.' But Jesus rebuked him, saying, 'Be silent, and come out of him.' The unclean spirit threw the man into convulsions, and with a loud cry emerged from him." Note, the unclean spirit knows who Jesus really is, and he asks the question, "Have you come to destroy us?" He knows that Jesus, as the only begotten Son of God, has the power and authority to enact the final judgment. When Jesus shows up and casts him out, he must have thought that the end has come for the world, and thus he will be cast into the abyss. You will see this repeated in several of the exorcisms that Jesus performed. The most famous example of Jesus performing an exorcism involves him casting the unclean spirits into pigs. I will read the passage. "They went across the lake to the region of the Gerasenes. When Jesus got out of the boat, a man with an impure spirit came from the tombs to meet him. This man lived in the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. For he had often been chained hand and foot, but he tore the chains apart and broke the irons on his feet. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and in the hills he would cry out and cut himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and fell on his knees in front of him. He shouted at the top of his voice, 'What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? In God's name, don't torture me.' For Jesus had said to him, 'Come out of this man, you impure spirit.' Then Jesus asked him, 'What is your name?' 'My name is Legion,' he replied, 'for we are many.' And he begged Jesus again and again not to send him out of the area. A large herd of pigs was feeding on the nearby hillside. The demons begged Jesus, 'Send us among the pigs. Allow us to go into them.' He gave them permission, and the unclean spirits came out and went into the pigs. The herd, about 2,000 in number, rushed down the steep bank into the lake and were drowned. Those tending the pigs ran off and reported this in the town and countryside, and the people went out to see what had happened. When they came to Jesus, they saw the man who had been possessed by the legion of demons sitting there, dressed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. Those who had seen it told the people what had happened to the demon-possessed man, and told about the pigs as well. Then the people began to plead with Jesus to leave their region. There is much to note here. Much. It is no accident that the unclean spirits asked to be sent into the pigs, an unclean animal. And where this possessed man had been chained is also highly important. It was in a cemetery. Any contact with the dead would make someone ritually unclean, and so a place devoted to the dead, a place with tombs, would be the only place he could be imprisoned in order to not ritually defile everyone around him. I will add this quick side note. I know we are going long today, but this is such an enormous topic that this could easily be an entire podcast on its own. But this idea of cemeteries rendering all who walk through them ritually unclean was very strong in Judaism, and it no doubt continues today. What you see here is a picture of the East Gate in Jerusalem today. Note, it is sealed up, and this is relevant to our discussion. There are tombs that have been placed in front of the entrance, and this is no accident. First, a little historical background about this East Gate. The Golden Gate is also referred to as the Golden Gate of Mercy, and is the oldest gate in Jerusalem's Old City, dating back to the 6th or 7th century A.D. It faces east towards the Mount of Olives, directly across from the Kidron Valley, and provides the most direct access to the Temple Mount. The gate was sealed shut in 1541 by the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, likely to prevent the Jewish Messiah, prophesied to enter Jerusalem through this gate, from fulfilling that prophecy. The Mount of Olives, just opposite this gate, hosts the largest Jewish cemetery in the world, where many hope to be resurrected when the Messiah comes. Now, according to Jewish law, a priest, like the Messiah, cannot pass through a cemetery without becoming ritually impure. So the tombs, and they're all Ottoman tombs, were specifically located there to prevent the Messiah's entry. The gate was also sealed with 16 feet of cement, reinforcing the physical and symbolic blockade. In Ezekiel chapter 42, verses 1 through 2, it describes a gate facing east that is to remain shut because the Lord, the God of Israel, has entered through it, and only a prince may enter it in the future. That's from Ezekiel 46, verse 12. There is, I believe today, a webcam perpetually trained on this gate that you can view on the internet to watch for the coming, if you're Jewish, or the second coming, if you're a Christian, of the Messiah. I mean, I know this is a giant rabbit hole I've opened up, but it is just very interesting. And it puts the fact that this demon-possessed man was imprisoned in the area of tombs into perspective. But back to the possessed man for a minute. Note again that the unclean spirits asked Jesus if he has come to torment them before the appointed time. Again, referencing back to the book of Enoch and other texts that say that the Son of God at the end of time will throw all the fallen spirits into the abyss. But also note that the spirits refer to themselves as us in the plural, and also as legion. A Roman legion typically consisted of 5,000 to 6,000 soldiers, making the name a metaphor for overwhelming force and organized domination. And as a military term, it also refers to war. And the Rephaim, back when they were alive, were warriors and were engaged in constant battle with the Israelites. So I think there's a reason that the demons are a legion. It harkens back to their old role that they had when they were alive, as warriors perpetually doing battle with the people of God. Now, We live in a skeptical age, and as I have pointed out from the beginning of this series, we all struggle with taking our 21st century blindfolds off when reading the Bible. So much of the last 50 years in Christian thinking has been a campaign of desupernaturalizing the Bible, and it's been a great mistake. Our modern sensibilities just can't get on board with demonic possession and evil spirits, and so many well-meaning Christians try to explain away these stories as metaphors or as ancient examples of psychological problems that Jesus healed. Look, I get that instinct, but it is just not true to the Bible. The fact remains that 1/3 of the miracles that Jesus performed in the New Testament were exorcisms. That was one of the main things he did when he entered a town. And it appears that the unclean spirits knew exactly who he was when he showed up and were stirred up by his presence. Sort of like someone hitting a hornet's nest with a baseball bat. If we psychologize all these stories, we miss the point. Jesus was engaged in direct spiritual warfare. It was part of his mission. And one of the dark forces he engaged with, quite a lot it seems, were these unclean spirits. And these unclean spirits were, as was largely believed in Jesus' day, the Rephaim, the spirits of the dead Nephilim. So, we have to deal with the reality of the Nephilim if we are to remain true to the gospel. As much as it offends our modernist worldview, we have no choice. They were and are a reality. To give another further example, consider Mary Magdalene, friend of the show. We will be discussing her next summer on her feast day. A fascinating and misunderstood saint and one of my favorites. She was one of Jesus' closest companions, the one he chose to first reveal himself to after his resurrection. She is a big deal. And one of the things we know about Mary Magdalene comes from the Gospel of Luke. It comes from Luke chapter 8, verse 2. And certain women which had been healed of evil spirits and infirmities, Mary called Magdalene, out of whom he sent 7 devils. Mary Magdalene was exorcised of unclean spirits by Jesus himself. This whole topic of exorcisms and possession is far too large for me to get into today in any depth. And as you have to be aware, it is a subject that has captured the imagination of the public like few others have. There are no shortage of movies and TV shows about the topic. No shortage. No doubt I will do an entire podcast, or possibly a few, just on this subject alone. It is a deep well to explore. But relating to this week's topic, to many people, and I was among them, they are surprised to learn of this ancient connection between demonic possession and the Rephaim, the dead spirits of the Nephilim. I will say once again, anyone who claims the Bible is boring hasn't really read it. Fascinating stuff here, and no doubt, I will be talking about exorcisms in further depth on another day. Because it's a very important topic. Because the Rephaim, unclean spirits, are still around and are still causing trouble. To give an example, the International Association of Exorcists was founded in 1991 by Father Gabriel Amorth to support Catholic priests in the ministry of exorcism amid rising concerns about occult practices and increased incidents of demonic possession. The association has grown over time to include 900 members from 58 countries with biannual meetings in Rome. The Vatican has noted a significant increase in exorcism requests over the past 2 decades. In the U.S. alone, the number of trained exorcists rose from 12 in 2005 to over 125 by 2023. The Rephaim are still among us. The spiritual war continues on to today. So, as we close out today, especially since we ended on such a dark and scary note, it is not a bad idea to finish up today's episode with the prayer of St. Michael, which I will read. Saint Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle. Be our defense against the wickedness and snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray. And do thou, O Prince of the heavenly hosts, by the power of God, thrust into hell Satan and all the evil spirits who prowl about the world seeking the ruin of souls. Amen. It has been a fascinating discussion today, and next week we will wrap up our series on the unseen realm and try somehow to pull all this together. I will see you next Saturday. Goodbye. Thank you for spending your Saturday morning with us. Next week, we'll be exploring yet another hero from our Christian past. So be sure to tune in. Until then, keep your faith warm, your cappuccino hot and frothy, and have a great week. See you next week for another Saturday Cappuccino with the Saints.